where you have 6 or 7 years of GDP in private wealth, if you make a mistake to the price of your housing stock, like what happened in Spain, but this has happened in many other countries, and this will happen again. This has very big consequences, because if you make a 10% mistake or a 15% mistake on a stock of 8 years of GDP, this has enormous consequences for the economy, much more than if you start from a 200%, 300%. So, I think this kind of data, if this was not available until very recently. In particular, it is only recently that national accounts produced national balance sheets that allow us to compute this kind of data. And I think, if the European Central Bank had this kind of data in 2007, maybe this would have been also a way to try to calm down the process in the banking sector, in particular in Spain, a bit earlier. So I think this has consequences for financial regulation, also to look at this kind of evolution. So now I mentioned 2 explanations for the increase in the wealth-to-income ratio. One was the growth slowdown, the other one was real estate price. Let me now mention a third explanation, which is a gradual transfer from public to private wealth. So let me show you, compare private wealth with public wealth. So I apologize that I don't have here the data for Spain, but I think given the increase in public debt in Spain recently, it will be very much the same evolution. So part of the increase in the private capital to income ratio is actually a transfer from public capital. So you can see, so what is public capital? Well, public capital is defined the same way as private capital. So you take all the assets owned by the government, the buildings, sometimes the financial portfolio of the government, minus the liability, so minus the public debt. So of course it can be negative. So look at Italy. Italy at the end of the period in 2010, and it will be even worse today, is negative. So what does it mean that Italy has negative public capital? It means that, and they have about minus 60-70% of national income in negative capital. So it means that even if the Italian government was to sell all the public assets, all the public buildings, all the public schools, public hospitals, everything there is to sell, that will not be enough to reimburse the public debt. Okay? So the public debt is bigger than the total value of all assets. So, I'm not saying that the Italian government should do this, and, I think many people will be shocked that if we had to pay rent to the private owners of the schools to which we send our children. But in a way, this is already what we are doing. Because when you have a public debt that is bigger than the value of the public assets, it means that you have to pay in interest payment sometimes more than what you would have to pay in rent to the private owners of your schools. And in the case of Italy, right now they are paying each year 5-6% of GDP in interest payment, and the total budget of their university system is 1% of GDP. Okay, so they are putting 5-6 times more resources into interest payments than into their university system. Now, is this the right way to invest in the future and to prepare the young generation for the future? I'm not so sure. So I didn't check the number for Spain, but the interest payment in Spain right now are certainly much bigger than the total budget of the university system. I don't know if it's 3-4% of GDP or I don't know, 5, whatever, but it's certainly 3-4 times bigger than the total budget of the university system, and it's like this pretty much everywhere in Europe, which to me doesn't look like the right strategy to prepare the future. And we can talk more about this if you have questions about the current European debate. Let's return to more historical analysis. What we have in this graph is that in pretty much every country you have a decline in public capital over the period. So in 2010, it's only in Italy that it's negative. In other countries like France or Germany or the US or Britain, it's slightly positive. This is because according to official estimates, so public debt is about like 80-90% of GDP in these countries, and the value of public assets is estimated to be a bit more than that, like 100-110% of GDP. So the difference between the two is slightly positive, but it's very small. Okay? It used to be a lot higher. So back in 1970, there was very little public debt, and the public sector was bigger, so the government owned more assets in companies or in buildings, so the public capital could be of the order of 100% of national income. So because at that time private wealth was only 2 to 3 years of national income, this means that, you know, although, of course, public capital is always less than private capital, because these countries have never been communist countries. So, you know, we all know this, but it's good to check on a graph, you know, to make sure that we didn't do anything wrong. But even though these countries were not communist, you know, in the 1970s, there was about 1/4 to 1/3 of the total capital that was owned by the public sector. So, you know, public capital was about between 1/4 and 1/3 of national capital. So national capital, of course, is the sum of the two, the sum of public and private capital. Okay, so part of the increase in private wealth over this period is due to the fact that there was a transfer, in effect, from public to private through privatization. So if you have less public assets and more public debt, you know, this can, you know, of course, you have a lower net public wealth. And, you know, look again at the case of Italy. Italy is at the bottom of the class for public capital and at the top of the class for private wealth. And of course, this is very much related. This is because part of the increase in the private wealth of Italians is that because they have bought some of the public debt issued by their own government and some of the privatized assets of their own government. So it is only part. You can see I have put the numbers, but you cannot probably not read the sentence at the bottom. You know, in Italy, private capital rose from 240% to 680% of national income between 1970 and 2010, whereas public capital dropped from +20 to -70. So the drop in public capital was about 1 year of national income. The increase in private is about 4 years. So you know, it's only about 1/4 of the increase in private wealth of Italians that corresponds to the fact that they have bought public debt and privatized assets of their own government. So it's not all of the increase. You know, it's only 1/4, but it's still significant. You know, you could find some other countries in the world where the privatization process has been much more extreme. You know, if I was to show you the same graph for Russia, for the Soviet Union, and for Russia, you know, you would have the share of public capital going from 100% to 0%. So you know, and private capital going from 0 to 100%. And of course, the Russian oligarchs did not become rich by saving. You know, they became rich by becoming the owners of big parts of their country, and in particular natural resources of their country, at very low prices. And so this was like a pure transfer from public to private wealth. Now, what has happened in capitalist countries, you know, it's a bit less extreme, of course, because we were capitalists to begin with, but it's a little bit of the same process, but in a less extreme way. Now, it's not necessarily bad to privatize assets. You know, in some cases, this can be justified. But, you know, when the net public wealth becomes zero or becomes negative, you know, I think it's probably a bit too small because it puts limits to what the government can do in order to invest in the future, invest in public infrastructure, invest in education. So this has probably gone a bit too far. So now let me move to the issue of inequality in wealth. And probably I should accelerate a little bit, and probably at some point someone should tell me when I should stop, or when I have like 5 minutes or 10 minutes left. You know, otherwise there's a risk that I never stop. So let me now talk about the rise of top wealth as compared to average wealth. You know, for now, I have not really talked about inequality of wealth. I talked mostly about the total value of wealth, private versus public wealth. So this is a table about inequality of wealth. And so this is a table using data, in fact, from the Forbes magazine ranking of billionaires. So let me tell you right away that this data is not particularly reliable. You know, I think it's a bit sad in a way that we have to read magazines to learn about top wealth holders. You know, I will prefer to live in a world where we can read Eurostat publication or IMF publication to learn about top wealth holders. But unfortunately, you will not find the information because the official data on wealth through wealth survey in order to measure inequality of wealth are not very reliable, in particular for top wealth groups and for cross-border financial assets. And so, in the book, I am very pragmatic about data sources. I use fiscal data sources when they exist. I use national accounts, but I also use, the wealth rankings that are published in magazines. They are not perfect, but, I think they give us a complementary viewpoint to other sources. And for the very top of the distribution, they are probably more reliable than the other sources than we have. So anyway, what do we learn? We have to do with what we have. So what do we learn from this ranking? So I start in 1987 because this is when the Forbes magazine started to publish their list of global billionaires. And so what I find is that if you take the very top group of wealth holders, their average wealth has increased very fast over this time period at about 6 to 7% per year on average after deduction of inflation, so in real terms, which is 3 to 4 times faster than average wealth in the world. So average wealth in the world has increased at 2% per year, average income at 1.4%. So world GDP has increased at 3.3% per year over this time period, but it's important to have in mind that although population growth is scheduled to go to zero, it's not zero yet. Okay? Population growth is still very high, right now. That's partly due to aging. And so, in fact, more than half of world GDP growth, 1.9% out of 3.3 was taken by population. And if you look at GDP per population, average income in the world, it has increased at only 1.4%, in spite of China, in spite of all emerging countries. Average wealth has increased a bit faster, 2.1. That's because of the increase in the wealth-income ratio that I mentioned before. But in any case, the top wealth holders seem to be rising 3 to 4 times faster than average wealth, which, of course, cannot continue forever. If you had such a situation, if the top rises 3 to 4 times faster than the average forever, then, in 50 years, you would have the share of total world wealth that belongs to billionaires that will go toward 100%, which, everybody, I think, would agree is too much. So this has to stop somewhere, and, I'm not saying this will go toward 100%. This will probably stop before that. Now, where exactly will this stop? Well, this is, the fact that we don't really know is, I think, in itself a problem. And I think it's important to understand that there is no natural force that sort of ensures, guarantees that it will stop at a point that is reasonable in any meaningful sense. I should also mention that what is the explanation for why the top is rising so fast? Sometimes people think, but this is because we have a lot of new entrepreneurs. Now, this is not really an explanation because, you have some new people who come to the top, but you also have some people at the top who go down. So in principle, these two effects should more or less compensate each other. So, here, of course, the top people in this list are not the same people between 1987 and 2013. In 1987, the top of the Forbes list, according to Forbes magazine, the top billionaires in the world were billionaires from Japan, which everybody has forgotten their name now. Whereas in 2013, you have people from Mexico, people from the US, people from China. So there is a lot of mobility at the top. So you have some people who go down, some people who go up. But if we were in an equilibrium of the world distribution of wealth, in principle, these two effects of people going down, people going up should compensate each other more or less, so that the average wealth of this group should rise approximately at the same speed as average wealth in the world. Well, maybe not exactly at the same speed, but you cannot have a situation where average wealth in some groups in societies is rising permanently 3 to 4 times faster than average wealth. Logically, this cannot continue forever. So this means that we are right now in a situation where the concentration of wealth is rising very fast. What are the explanations? I think the privatization process that I mentioned earlier played a big role in this time period. You know, a significant part of the new billionaires over this time period come from ex-communist countries, where it was clearly the privatization process that created them. You know, again, you know, the Russian oligarchs did not invent anything. You know, there was no significant innovation coming from their side. You know, they just became rich by becoming the owners of big pile of natural resources. Now, even some of the people that we view more as entrepreneurs, you know, sometimes it's related to a privatization process that happened in Europe, which were made sometime in very favorable terms, you know, for very low prices. Not only in Europe, but, you know, also in Mexico, you know, maybe many people feel that the fortune of Carlos Slim has something to do with the opening of the telecom industry in Mexico and the way, you know, sometimes some people are able to become the owners of a big part of the industry. You know, certainly this contributed to this evolution. Another part of the explanation could be that the financial deregulation has probably increased the inequality in financial returns. So, you know, when I talk about R versus G, you know, as I said before, it's important to realize that the rate of return R is not the same for everybody. So even if the gap between the average rate of return and the growth rate of the economy, G, is not so large. You know, maybe the average rate of return is 3 or 4%, and the growth rate of the economy is 1 or 2%. Well, right now in Europe, it's closer to 0 because of our bad policies. But you know, even if we do better than that, let's say 1 to 2%, and the rate of return 3 and 4, in fact, not everybody is getting the same average rate of return of 3 and 4. So just to illustrate this point, let me show you some data on the return to capital endowments of US universities. So the reason I am talking now about universities is just because at least we have a lot of data about this capital returns and capital endowment, because at least the US universities publish financial statements, very precise, where we know exactly the portfolio, how they invest their money, whereas for the Forbes people, nobody really knows. And, you know, maybe the Forbes number are underestimating the top wealth growth. Maybe they are overestimating. You know, we don't really know. So here at least we have good data. And so as you can see, they have done very well over this period. So you have 850 US universities with capital endowments. On average, the rate of return has been 8.2%. So this is a real rate of return. So this is after deduction of inflation and after deduction of all administrative costs and financial fees. Okay? And you can see that the higher your initial endowment, the higher the return. So take Harvard, Yale, Princeton. They have 10.2%, which is quite good over this period. So how do you explain this? Okay, so maybe the period was particularly good, you know, 1980, 2010 for world financial markets, real estate investment. And, you know, I'm not saying it will be as spectacular in the next 30 years, but, you know, even if it declines a little bit, I think some of this same mechanism will apply. So what are these mechanisms? I think in many ways financial deregulation, you know, has made it more, you know, has increased the inequality in access to sophisticated financial products. So if you take the case of Harvard, you know, clearly these people, they don't buy US Treasury bonds. You know, I don't know, you know, there are some people in the world who put their money in US Treasury bonds. I don't know why, but, you know, clearly US universities have not done that for a very long time. So what they do is that they have, you know, sophisticated financial derivatives, commodity derivatives, private equity, you know, they do very sophisticated investment, and they pay people for this. So if you take Harvard today, in fact, they pay only 0.3% of their endowment each year in administrative and management fees. But because they have an endowment which is now between 30 and 40 billion dollars, 0.3% is still about 100 million. So if you can spend 100 million each year in paying a group of wealth managers, you know, you can pay a good group of wealth managers. And if these people get you a return of 10 rather than 6, you know, this is worth spending 0.3% for them. Now, if you have an endowment of 100 million, of course, you cannot spend 100 million each year in management fees. And, if you have 10,000 euros, you can ask your brother-in-law about, what to do with your money, but that's all you can do, and probably that's not going to work too well. Okay, so I think the sophisticated, according to the economic textbook, more sophisticated financial markets are supposed to bring the best return on the planet for everybody. This is how the textbook model is supposed to work. You go to your bank, even with 10,000 euros, and the next morning it gets invested in the highest possible return on the planet. That doesn't seem to be working this way. Apparently it's more a system where some people keep the best assets for them and sell to the rest of the population pretty bad assets. So what are the solutions? And let me conclude now. There are many ways to redistribute wealth. Probably the most civilized way is progressive taxation, but there are many other ways. Inflation has played a very important role in the past. In particular, I mentioned the issue of public debt. We've already seen in the past public debt of even 200% of GDP, but very often inflation played a very big role to get rid of them. In particular, Germany and France had a public debt of 200% of GDP in 1945, and then in 1950s they had only 20% of GDP in public debt. So what happened? Well, of course, they never reimbursed the public debt. The public debt was destroyed by inflation and partly by debt repudiation, and this was a good decision because this made it much easier in the 1950s and 60s to invest in growth, to invest in public infrastructure, to invest in education. If Germany and France had to repay 200% of GDP public debt by having budget surplus of 1 or 2% of GDP each year, you can make the computation. We would still be paying back the public debt, and this would have been a very bad decision for post-war growth. Now, the only problem is that these two countries now want the south of Europe to pay it back with zero inflation, which, I think has been a very selfish decision and also a very inefficient decision, because at the end of the day, we all have very low growth, which is not so good for our societies. And I think it's important. One of the lessons of history is that with zero inflation, it's very difficult to reduce the public debt of this kind. Now, does this mean that inflation is the perfect way? No, as I mentioned, the most democratic and the most transparent and the most civilized way to redistribute wealth and to solve inequality or public debt problem is progressive taxation, in particular progressive taxation of private wealth. This is like the civilized form of inflation. It's doing exactly the same as inflation. It's taking on private wealth in order to reduce public debt because, you have to take the money somewhere. It's not, so it has to come from private wealth, except that with inflation, you target a lot people with low wealth who have saving accounts with nominal accounts, whereas people with a lot of wealth on the stock market or real estate, they don't really lose from inflation. With a progressive tax on private wealth, you can do the opposite. Now, will it happen? I think, let me just conclude, and this is the last slide I show you, and my real conclusion, that the history of taxation is full of surprise. So this is a short history of income taxation. So these are the top income tax rate that applied in US, UK, Germany, France over the past century. So let me make clear that these are the top income tax rate. So these are the tax rate applying to the very highest income, usually to a very small group of the population. So when you have a 90% tax rate in the US or in the UK in the post-war period, it applies, that will be to the income, in today's income, that will be above $1 million in annual income. So this will be, to less than 1% of the population. It will be 0.1% of the population. And this is why, apparently, so in the US, in the UK, you had, if you take the average in the US between 1930 and 1980, you have a tax rate of 82%. It's sometimes 70, sometimes 90. And apparently, this did not destroy American capitalism, probably because paying top managers $10 million rather than one is it's not so useful for the economy. You know, I tried hard to find the effect on the performance and job creation of the corresponding companies, and I could not find it in the data. So, you know, what you can conclude from this graph is, you know, first that, you know, there is a lot of surprise in the history of taxation, and also that there are different ways to organize capitalism. You know, you can see that the US and the UK, until the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, had gone very far in the direction of tax progressivity. This is true for the income tax. This is also true for the taxation of inheritance. So the graph looks a lot similar. These are the top rate applying to the largest inheritance of wealth. So you can see again the US and the UK have gone very far, 70–80%. It's interesting to see, you know, France and Germany did not use progressive taxation as intensively as Anglo-Saxon countries, partly because the war and the capital destruction due to the war did a lot of the redistribution. Okay, so war and destruction, of course, is another way to redistribute wealth. You know, you have inflation, taxation, you also have destruction. And this is probably why France and Germany did not use progressive taxation as much as... So it's interesting to see, and I will conclude there, that Germany, the only time when you have very high top tax rate in Germany is between 1946 and 1948. And this is also, look here, Germany, 1946 to 1948, you have a 90% top tax rate. This is when the tax policy of Germany is set by the Americans. Okay, this is the Allied Control Council that is setting the tax policy of Germany. And when Germany takes its sovereignty back in 1949, they go down, you know, to 70–50% in the 1950s, and they don't want to stay with this crazy American level of 90% top tax rate. And it is the same in Japan. Japan, the only time where you have 90% top tax rate is 1946, 1948, when it's set by the Americans. Now, it's important to realize that the Americans, they were not doing this in order to punish the Germans or the Japanese, because they were doing the same thing at home in America. So this was, in their view of the time, this was part of the civilization package. You bring a democratic institution, and at the same time you bring fiscal institution that prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy with excessive concentration of economy. So I know that this can seem very exotic to you today, and this looks like ancient history, but you know, this is not so old, and I think this is part of our common history, and we need to have all of this in mind together with the history of the public debt in order to find better solution for the future. So let me stop there, and sorry for being so long.
Bien, estaba previsto que levantáramos esta sesión a la 1, pero es evidente que no, que vamos a tener unos minutos más. Ahora me dirás cuántos, 20 minutos de coloquio. Bien, mientras llegan las preguntas, yo quería hacerle una pregunta primera a nuestro amigo, mientras se calienta el ambiente. ¿Qué explicación tiene que la bajada de impuestos sea tan popular? ¿Por qué una de las medidas de hacer, uno de los modos de hacer electoralismo es bajar los impuestos? En Estados Unidos parece que es que los pobres no votan. Entonces, pues si solo votan los ricos, pues bajar los impuestos les estimula a los votantes. Pero en la Unión Europea votan más, o sea, el número de pobres es mayor que el de ricos, vamos hablando así de manera muy rápida, y por consiguiente a las urnas llegan más votos de pobres que de ricos. Y sin embargo es muy popular. Ahora mismo lo estamos viendo en España, todo se prepara para bajar impuestos porque eso tiene un gran tirón electoral.
Okay, so first let me make clear that the decline in taxation and the tax cuts these are only for the very high income groups and high wealth group. If you take the entire population, you certainly don't have a decline in taxation. In fact, there's been an increase in taxation, in particular in recent years. I can tell you in France, there was actually a very big increase in taxation, actually both in the last year of Sarkozy and the first year of Hollande, through value-added tax, through the income tax on everybody, by not indexing the tax bracket to inflation. And in my view, there was a far too big increase in taxation, and this was because of the austerity plan to reduce the public deficit in Europe, and I think we've increased taxation too much, and we've tried to reduce the public deficit too fast. And so I can see why, I can understand why people certainly don't want more increase in taxation. So in my view, the problem is not to increase the total taxation, but rather to transform the tax system so that you ask more, for instance, for high wealth groups or high income groups, and you ask less to to workers, to middle wage and low wage groups. So it's not, when we live at a time period where the total tax revenue is pretty large, 40 to 50% of GDP in many European countries. So, and I think nobody is seriously thinking of increasing this to a much higher level. So the reason why it's difficult is first that, well, we need to transform the structure of the tax system rather than simply increase total tax. In the post-war period, it was easier in a way because we started from a much smaller government after the Great Depression. So there was, in a way, an easy solution to the problem was the extension of government with more and more tax resources and more public spending. Today, the problem we have to solve is more complicated because we are not going to just increase total taxation. We have to transform the structure of taxation, but without increasing the total tax revenue. Now, the reason also why it's particularly complicated in Europe is because European countries are small countries as compared to the size of the world economy, and sometimes some countries like Germany or France or even Italy or Spain imagine that they are bigger than Belgium and Ireland, and it is true that we are a little bit bigger, but at the end of the day we are all very small as compared to the size of the world economy. And so small countries tend to behave in a way that is sometimes in complete contradiction with their basic social values and objectives. And in particular, we all have an incentive to try to steal the tax base of our neighbor, to attract the mobile tax base, so the capital holders and the top income holders. And the consequence is that then we have to tax even more our taxpayers who cannot move, so typically low-skilled workers and middle-wage workers. And this is why we are in a situation where many of these low-skilled and medium-skilled groups feel abandoned by the government in charge, and sometimes turn to a nationalist solution as a solution. Although, of course, this is not a solution, but in a way, the equilibrium in which we are in Europe today, is very favorable to the high skill and high wealth groups who can often get much better policies and deals for them than the lower groups. Look at the recent Luxembourg leaks scandal in Europe. It's really incredible. The large multinational corporations, are paying almost no tax. They are paying an effective tax rate on their profits, which is less than what our small and medium-sized companies are paying. And so this is the real scandal. The good news is that we could do a lot better, if we change the way we take decision on fiscal affairs. I think to me the real lesson of the Luxembourg leaks scandal is that it's not enough for Juncker to apologize. These are really the European institutions themselves which should be changed. And as long as we have unanimity decision making for fiscal affairs, there will be other Luxembourg leaks scandal, and there will be other countries that will try to steal the tax base of their neighbor. And, this is what Juncker came to the European press and said everywhere. He said, well, this is not my fault. There was desindustrialization. I had to find a new development strategy for my country. And the strategy was to steal the tax base of my neighbor. But I had no other choice. but look, this is crazy, because we all have the same desindustrialization problem. So if we all come with this solution of stealing the tax base to our neighbor, is that going to be the future of Europe? It's not by investing in tax optimization. We need to invest in education, in innovation, and for this we need tax revenue, and we need a tax structure that is fair. Otherwise, the middle class will not accept to pay more than the very rich and forever. So we have to move to majority decision-making on corporate taxation in Europe, and probably we can do that only with a smaller number of countries within the Eurozone, and then if it works, then we can, maybe other countries will want to join. But at this stage, the Eurozone is not working at all, so nobody wants to join something that's not working. So I think, that's part of the reason why it's complicated, is that we have to better organize our large political community, which we are trying to organize in Europe, but that's difficult.
A ver, aquí esta señora verde, aquí, primero tú. No, bueno, pues primero esta señora. Podéis decir vuestro nombre y si pertenecéis a alguna universidad o institución, pues también.
Okay, hello. I'm going to ask the question in English, if that's okay, so we don't get lost in translation. My name is Mar Cabra. I work for ICIJ, who just published the Luxleaks, so thank you very much for mentioning us. You're talking about progressive taxation as one of the solutions, but how do you think progressive taxation can work if the offshore world is more and more important every time, and secrecy makes very difficult to find out what happens there? So can you elaborate a little bit more of the role of the offshore world and how the secrecy maybe need to be taken out to solve this?
Sure. So financial transparency is absolutely key to any progress we might want to make in this area. So as long as we have the level of opacity that we have today in Luxembourg, in Switzerland, and this will not work. Now the good news is that this can change, and of course what you've done with Luxembourg Leaks can contribute, I think, to this kind of change. But now we have to put pressures on our governments to make it happen, because I think the problem is that there is very often a huge gap between what our governments claim they have done regarding tax havens and what they really do, which is most of the time very little, if not nothing at all. So if you think of the case of bank secrecy in Switzerland, the only reason why we've made a little bit of progress in recent years is just because the United States government took sanctions on Swiss banks and said, okay, if you don't transmit to us the information on what US taxpayers have in Swiss banks, then you will lose your banking license in the US. And then suddenly the Swiss government said, okay, maybe we are going to change our tax law. And in a way, it is very sad that the European countries were not able to do it before. Because look, in Spain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, we are much more at risk, we are much more threatened by bank secrecy in Switzerland or in Luxembourg than the United States. But, at the end, I prefer to look at this episode in a more optimistic manner, which is that if we take the right sanctions, we can make things change. But, we cannot just ask politely to tax havens to stop being tax havens and to people who benefit from financial opacity to stop benefiting from financial opacity. We have to put sanctions which are in line with the benefits that some people are getting from financial opacity. So this could involve, taking away the banking license. This could involve trade sanctions. I believe in free trade, but I think you cannot have free trade and free capital flows without any regulation in exchange. The problem in Europe is that we have been accustomed for so long, to have free trade and free capital flows with nothing in exchange, without any reporting of information, that we feel this is the normal way to go. And Switzerland and Luxembourg and other territories, and every country is playing this little game. I think we have to realize that this won't change, I think, without a deep change in the political and democratic institutions of Europe. So to be very concrete, as long as we have unanimity rules for fiscal affairs, we will not make any progress. And so if some countries want to stick with unanimity, okay, they can, but they cannot make it impossible if a smaller number of countries want to move to majority decision-making with specific political institutions like a Eurozone parliament or a parliament for a smaller number of countries that want to move ahead. And also, these countries must be able to take sanctions on those countries, including within the European Union, who don't want to cooperate and who want to live out of financial opacity. So that's the only reason why it's difficult. It's not technical or economic. It's just ideological. Is that we have been accustomed for so long that you don't need any counterpart to free trade and free capital flows that it's hard now to change our mind.
Muchas gracias. Estate tranquila, porque el presidente Rajoy ya ha hecho un trabajo enorme en Andorra y se ha traído una vajilla Duralex.
Soy Fran Serrato, soy alumno del máster de periodismo del país. Decía Rifkin, el profesor Rifkin, que la diferencia entre Estados Unidos y Europa es que Europa no dejaba a nadie en la cuneta. Esto en gran medida fue gracias a los partidos socialdemócratas. Los partidos socialdemócratas se han abandonado en políticas neoliberales. Usted mismo hace unos días rechazó una condecoración, la máxima condecoración en Francia, de un gobierno que... Y quería saber en qué situación se encuentra, por ejemplo, aquí el Partido Socialista Español, ¿cómo lo ve usted? ¿Cómo ve el futuro de la socialdemocracia y las alternativas que plantean partidos como Syriza y Podemos? Muchas gracias.
Bien, si te parece, querido Tomás, vamos a embalsar varias preguntas, porque es que si no... se nos va a ir el tiempo y no va a poder preguntar nada más que 2 o 3. Sigo por este lado. Aquí tenemos otra pregunta.
Oui.
Sí.
Bonjour, Xavier Rouland, je suis le directeur général d'EDF en Espagne et aussi membre de Dialogo, qui est l'association d'amitié franco-espagnole. Ma question est suivante, elle est un peu absconte, c'est un peu une question d'économisme, enfin vous l'êtes, donc on est là pour ça. Vous avez parlé d'inflation, de dette publique. Mentionner que l'inflation était une manière, historiquement on l'a vu, de réduire les dettes publiques. Aujourd'hui en Europe, on a un très gros problème de dette publique, on le sait, et en même temps on a une inflation qui n'a jamais été aussi basse, puisqu'on parle même de déflation. On sait tous que la Banque Centrale Européenne est indépendante, mais malgré tout je pose cette question, pourquoi n'utilise-t-on pas ce levier pour réduire la question de la dette publique et par-delà même, dans ce que vous expliquiez, aussi des inégalités de capital.
Bien, vamos a terminar con este lado. Ahí hay 2 preguntas. Y ahora voy a ir a la derecha, pero es por dar primer turno al lado del Evangelio antes de ir al lado de la epístola.
Hola, me llamo Sergio Hernández y quería pedirle un comentario sobre el papel que juega o debe jugar el Estado en América Latina y en México en particular ante los riesgos que nos ha comentado.
Muchas gracias. A ver, ahí atrás otra más y enseguida venimos aquí, José Antonio, sin problema.
Sí, soy Luciano Cañizares. Le quería preguntar, como antes ha explicado la fórmula de Einstein, mc cuadrado. C es la velocidad de la luz, que es 300.000 por 300.000. O sea, una solución es la energía barata, que es la nuclear, que parece ser que va a ir en el 50, que no contamina ni nada. Entonces, si se invierte el capital para adelantar, como se hizo con la revolución industrial, en la máquina de vapor, se desarrolló porque se metió ahí capital. Si ese en el 2050 lo adelantáramos a 2020, tuviéramos energía barata, ¿qué pasaría con el crecimiento y con la desigualdad? Si eso lo pudiéramos adelantar.
Muchas gracias. ten cuidado que está bajando muchísimo el petróleo y eso nos puede hundir con la energía barata. Aquí vamos a este lado. A ver, ¿quién trae el micrófono? ¿Quién lo cambia de...? No, pero... A ver, ¿me quieres ayudar, Francisco Arbós, en organizar ese...?
Sí. Buenos días. Soy Jaime Atienza de Oxfam Intermón. Trabajamos sobre el tema de desigualdad. Como decía Miguel Ángel, su libro ha ayudado a que la desigualdad sea parte de la gran temática y la gran discusión. Estamos discutiendo ahora qué políticas hay que poner en marcha. Usted plantea el tema del impuesto, el impuesto a las grandes riquezas, y hay otras medidas que están en discusión. ¿Dónde cree que hemos empezado a avanzar y qué avances cree que podemos esperar en los próximos años, en los años inmediatos?
Thank you, Mr. Piketty. My name is Lucas Gortázar from the World Bank, and I have the following reflection to make. The southern European countries like France, Italy, Spain, Portugal are also facing different problems, but in the welfare state, with regards to the welfare state, what we are observing, I work as an economist on human development issues, is an stagnation of the education system. We do not advance, we do not generate better human capital, the skills of the population are stagnated. To what extent, the way I would like to see, to understand the way you feel this and the way you think about this issue.
Hi, my name is Max. I'm still a student at Carlos III University. I'd like to know, because this year, 2015, in Spain, we have some elections. So I'd like to know if you think that a single country would be able to start taxing capital more than it is nowadays, or it's necessary to have like the whole European Union or even the US, or like if you think that a single country taxing capital would lead to capital going away from that country. Thanks.
Tú también, espera.
Eduardo Leira, arquitecto. I can ask in English if you prefer. We are told that wages will not be able to be anymore indexed with prices. They should be linked to productivity. In your graphs, I think from the 80s to now, productivity in the United States have increased extremely, but the productivity was absolutely captured by the higher incomes and by capital. Then the wages are stopped. Productivity increased, but no wages. Then this we listen every day. All our very knowledge people say no. Productivity is for them also.
Bien, José Antonio, por favor, pon orden con tu pregunta, sí.
Muchas gracias, Miguel Ángel. Mi nombre es José Antonio Martínez Soler y soy un feliz jubilado. Antes periodista. Perdón que haga una mención a la primera frase del libro de Adam Smith, en El origen de la riqueza de las naciones, que preguntaba cuál es el origen de la riqueza. Y decía que era el trabajo de las gentes. El trabajo era el origen de la riqueza. Si comparamos el primer gráfico que usted ha puesto, el de Simon Goodnet, muy interesante, y cómo se ve el bache, cómo la estabilidad en la desigualdad está entre la Guerra Mundial y la caída del muro de Berlín, más o menos, y lo superponemos a este último. La verdad que del primer gráfico al último ha sido un baño de ducha escocesa, agua fría y agua caliente, y vemos exactamente que desde la Guerra Mundial hasta la caída del muro de Berlín tenemos un top income tax rate enorme, arriba, la capa. Entonces, tendremos que concluir quizás que lo que está sugiriendo es que o bien una guerra soluciona la desigualdad.
Hombre, si se te ocurre otra cosa más suave.
Ha dicho el profesor Piketty que una forma más civilizada es subir los impuestos. Es decir, ya sé que la guerra no es recomendable,
Ya.
no lo traigo. Entonces la otra solución, que es la que él dice, propone, solución civilizada es subir los impuestos como en esa época, desde la guerra mundial hasta la caída del muro. ¿Qué tienen que ver en este sentido las ideas para cambiar la riqueza de las naciones? Las ideas, no el trabajo de las gentes. Porque lo que veo es que el muro de Berlín, la guerra mundial, lo que trae es el comunismo también como amenaza al capitalismo y la socialdemocracia como aceptación de algo hay que dar para que no nos quiten lo que tenemos. Desaparece el muro de Berlín, cae el comunismo, no hay amenaza y la expansión del capitalismo no tiene freno. No hay ningún muro que lo pare. ¿Cómo sugiere que podamos llegar a esa solución civilizada de subir los impuestos a los ricos? ¿Se dejarán? Gracias.
Bien, querido profesor, si puedes ir dando respuestas a todo esto mientras embalsamos otro turno de preguntas.
Okay, so let me try to answer. So let me start by the last question. So do we need another war to have better regulation or better redistribution? I think we can do without a war. I think we can do much better this time. But it is true that it's important to realize that a big part of the history of inequality and redistribution in the 20th century was due to very violent shocks, and not only to World War I and World War II, but as you say, the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of communism probably played a big role in making the elite accept social reforms and fiscal reform, which they refused until 1914. And in particular in my country, in France, it's very striking to see that until World War I, until the summer of 1914, people didn't want an income tax, and it's interesting to see that a big part of the Republican elite in France before until World War I was saying, okay, basically we've done the French Revolution. So that's enough, basically. So progressive taxation, maybe that's useful in an aristocratic country like Britain. So that's good. They have a progressive income tax. That's what they need. But us, we don't need, because now that we have made the revolution and that we have equality under the right of property, we don't need. We are a country of small property owners. We don't have aristocrats anymore. Now, of course, this was very hypocrite, because at that time, aristocratic landed estate, did not matter anymore, even in Britain. And in fact, what I found in the data is that the inequality of property and the concentration of capital was just as extreme in France in 1913 as in Britain, and because these were much more modern capital holdings, including real estate, business, international investment, and the laws governing the inequality of these assets, are not really changed by the fact that we were a republic rather than a monarchy. So I think, yes, the level of hypocrisy of the elite sometimes is quite impressive, and so it's important to remember these lessons of the past. But I think we can do better in the future. We can do we can manage to find ways to address our problem in a more peaceful manner. And I certainly believe in the power of ideas, the power of democracy, and this is just a book, but I think this can contribute a little bit to democratization of economic knowledge. But of course, this depends on what we all do as citizens in every country in Europe. So, I had several questions about what are the policies to implement in Europe. Probably the most important policy in the long run to reduce inequality and to have higher growth at the same time in Europe is to invest in education. And I am very obsessed with the underinvestment in education that we have in Europe right now. I mentioned these numbers about Italy, spending 5-6% of GDP in interest payment on their public debt, whereas at the same time, the total budget of their university system is 1% of GDP. And, this is the same in Spain or in France. All across Europe, we put more money at paying interest payment to ourselves than we are putting into our entire university system. And, the only historical precedent that I can think of such a situation was Britain in the 19th century, where during, they had a huge public debt after the Napoleonic Wars. They had 200% of GDP, so even more than Greece today. And instead of getting rid of the public debt through inflation and debt repudiation, which is what Germany and France did in 1945, 1950, Britain in the 19th century decided to do it in the British civilized way of the time, which is, so there was zero inflation. It's like Europe today. And, I think deflation is a big danger for Europe today. And, it was exactly the same in Britain 19th century because this was the gold standard. And in fact, inflation was even slightly negative. So they reduced, they had this 200% of GDP public debt in 1815, and they brought it down to 20% in 1913. So it worked, but it took an entire century of budget surplus. And during an entire century, they had 2-3% of GDP each year of budget surplus, which was more money than the entire resources that they were putting into their school system and education system. So during an entire century, they put 1/4 of their tax revenue, because at that time tax revenue were quite small, like 10% of GDP, were paid to rentiers of the British public debt. And this was more than what they were investing in their education system. And many people believe that this was the beginning of the decline in labor productivity in Britain, and that this partly explained why labor productivity in Britain, declined below Germany, below France, or even below Italy during the 20th century at some point. So, I'm very afraid that we make the same mistake in Europe right now, which is that, if we keep doing what we do with inflation close to zero and very low growth, reducing a public debt of 100% of GDP or even more in Italy or Greece, this will take 30, 40, 50 years. So, and people who believe that this is realistic and that this is the only way, I think this is not realistic at all. So how do we get away of deflation in Europe right now? I think that's very difficult for the European Central Bank to implement a realistic inflation target and to increase inflation as long as the European Central Bank has 80